Hi, TBR listeners. Quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Greg Goin is a registered representative of Equitable Distributors, LLC. Equitable is the brand name of the retirement and protection subsidiaries of Equitable Holdings Incorporated, including Equitable Financial Life Insurance Company, New York, New York, Equitable Financial Life Insurance Company of America, an AZ stock company, and Equitable Distributors, LLC. This informational and educational discussion is not intended and should not be relied upon as investment or financial advice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Perfect RIA podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Jarvis, and with me today, a special guest, something that we've only done twice in the history of the show, Greg Goin, who is a regional VP for Equitable. And you've worked with a lot of advisors all over the industry. And so we're really excited to have you on for what we've been calling Confessions of a Wholesaler, to really kind of dive in and say, all right, for someone who's seen a lot of practices. So Greg, thanks for coming. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's take just 1 minute for our listeners. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and your background. Establish for us a little bit of a picture, if you will, of how we ended up here together.
Yeah, so it's funny because this kind of all goes back to one individual who I've known my entire career, who you had on a prior show, Ross Welty.
Yeah.
And I helped him connect the dots to his journey to independence, leaving from his established position as a broker-dealer advisor, transitioning to full independence, and actually starting his own registered investment advisory firm a couple of years ago. And for me, I started my journey in a practice. I started working for an advisor when I came into the business, obtained my licenses, and then I started branching out into the world of more of the institutional side.
Yep.
And so I actually started my career at Allianz, and I spent about 11 years there and migrated out into the field. In the last 4 years that I was at Allianz, I worked specifically with registered investment advisors. And so I was actually covering a large swath of the country. I had 8 states. I was part of a team of about 7 people, and we were tasked with growing fee-based annuities as well as buffered ETFs in the registered investment advisory community.
Sure, yeah.
And then most recently, I joined Equitable, just covering Minnesota and South Dakota. So it gave me an opportunity to really shrink my footprint, be home a lot more, and work with a lot different advisors just in my local area versus having to cover a large swath of the country. So that's kind of been my journey over the last 11 years between a couple different institutions. Throughout that process, I obtained my CFP early on, my CIMA, a couple of designations, and I've always tried to be a student of the industry.
I love that. Well, what has me really excited to have you on the show today, Greg, is like you said, you've worked in the RIA space with the fee-based annuities, with the buffered ETFs. You've worked in the more traditional broker-dealer space. You worked across 8 states. I mean, you've seen far more practices than probably I've ever seen. And so I'd love to hear from you. Are there any examples that come to mind where you think, wow, this is an advisor, you don't need to name any names, but this is an advisor or a theme that really successful advisors are following? Or conversely, here's something I see advisors get hung up on in the wrong way all the time.
Sure. I mean, planning has definitely taken over the last 4 or 5 years. And you see it in every practice manifesting itself differently. I mean, I think advisors evolved off of like the notepad and the spreadsheet. And there are some that still have their own homegrown systems that they rely on.
Yeah.
But with the advent of Money Guide Pro, Right Capital, eMoney, all of the different technology platforms that have become more accessible and scalable for firms, whether they're a $100 million firm to a $1 billion firm, you see a lot of similarities that planning is a core tenet, right? We've moved away from just assets under management. We saw the fee compression and returns and portfolio construction became more commoditized. Now there's a more holistic adoption. You see it across the industry, regardless of your affiliation, whether you're with LPL or you're with a $3 billion firm. And I saw a lot of commonalities. But what I noticed a major difference was, the way they were using those softwares, whether you're working at a goals-based model or cash flow, because as you get to a higher net worth client, you have way more sophisticated needs, right? You've got estate planning, you have different goals and objectives. The things that I found to be interesting or did not transfer over was the implementation. From somebody who has, let's say, more of a broker-dealer setup where they've got access to all different solution sets, they usually implement those themselves, whether it be annuities, insurance, the portfolio. That's all handled by that individual. Whereas in the RIA community, you see a lot of outsourcing. If an advisor is going to access, let's say, insurance or annuities, by default, being a 65-only advisor, they can't, right? They cannot accept a commission. So there has been a new ecosystem that's grown up that's allowed them to implement in a totally outsourced fashion. And that's still something that's emerging and growing. There's not a whole lot of awareness on.
Yeah, there's definitely not. I think a lot of times, especially when we talk about any kind of insurance products, right? They sort of unfairly get lumped into, that's a commission-based product, therefore it is evil, or somehow it's not evil if I have somebody else do it or something like that. But that that's really evolved around, right? Equitable, Allianz, a lot of these companies have RA, what we call RA friendly options,
Yes.
which have a place. So how are you seeing RAs use that? I don't want to feel like this is a pitch for RA friendly annuities, but you get to see the whole spectrum, the BD side to the RA side. So are you seeing more of a shift in the RA space, saying, hey, there are clients who need this despite the cost?
Gradually, yes. And I think through planning, you're identifying opportunities, whether somebody's not at what I would say their target success rate. A lot of people target 85 to 95% success in a plan. Not necessarily the be all end all, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to achieve that outcome, but they do address gaps, whether it's cash flow or risk management through the software. And it gives them an opportunity to have a productive or proactive conversation with a client. But I still see it largely as reactive. A client might bring them something. They're onboarding somebody from it's a new relationship to the firm, and they say, hey, I've got this annuity. What is it? How does it work? How do I deal with it? And they'll often come to us and say, hey, what do we do? Do you have an understanding of it? Should my client keep it? Can we build it into the plan? Is there something different? Is there something potentially better that I could find for them that's commission free, that might be fully liquid, that allows me to bill my fees? So I would say it's starting to slowly transition from reactive to proactive, but there's still a huge education gap when it comes to what these are. To your point, I remember showing up at a NAPFA meeting a number of years ago, and they asked us what we were doing here. Like legitimately, like, why are you here? We cannot do this business. And we almost laughed because we had to educate them and say, well, you can, right? This is something that's emerging. And as a 65 only advisor, as a fiduciary, you can incorporate this, and here's how. So it's still a large education gap in the industry to know that these exist and there's ways for you to implement it in a fiduciary manner.
Yeah, for sure. I was at the XYPN conference last year, and I forget, there was an insurance company that sponsored part of that, and there was some grumblings again about like, hey, why is this going on? And I liked your comment, Greg, as a fiduciary, right? The definition of fiduciary is that you disclose and fairly manage conflicts of interest, right? There's nothing in the fiduciary standard that says thou shalt not look at insurance products. In fact, it almost implies the opposite, right? If there's products or services that you are completely ignoring for your clients, that in itself is a breach of your fiduciary duty. You're saying like, hey, this is an inconvenience for me, therefore I'm not going to look at it. You haven't disclosed to your clients, hey, listen, I'm not going to talk to you about any insurance products because I don't want to deal with it. So yeah, there's definitely an education piece that's missing in the RA space for sure.
Yeah, and I'll never forget an experience I had a couple of years ago. I went down and met with a multi-billion-dollar firm, and we sat with their head of planning, and we spent a couple of hours identifying plans and case studies where maybe lifetime income could be a benefit to that client. And we took a client that was in their low 70s as far as their confidence score in e-money, and we were able to implement a solution that brought them up to almost 90%. And the advisor was a bit taken aback. And then they asked the question, how do I not put this in front of my client? There'll never be something I forget. It'll always stick with me because I was a little bit dumbfounded by the question. And my gut response would to say, and I wouldn't actually say this in person, was, well, I don't know, you're a fiduciary, you tell me. But there were so many instances where I'd sit down with those individuals that we would build something into a client's plan and they wouldn't take action. And that is a huge missing piece because now you've seen the empirical evidence of what this could do to your practice and your clients and improve their outcomes, but you don't implement. And that's the biggest gap that I see between the, I guess, more established broker-dealer community where insurance is generally accepted as an asset class and is used versus the RA community where, like you said before, there's just a different viewpoint on the entire category. And it's not necessarily the most positive.
Yeah, for sure. And lest any listeners, especially listeners that grew up in the RA-only space, feel like this is some kind of shill for annuities. What we're talking about here, and the reason we have Greg on here is you need to be aware of everything that's going on. Not that you should become an expert in all things, but again, you need to have awareness of what things are out there. Even if you disagree, even if you look and you say, hey, I've done the numbers, and based on how I approach clients, I really feel annuities never have a place ever. Okay, that's fine. Like that's your conclusion you've come to, but you still need to explore all those options. Same would be true for structured settlements. Same would be true for index-linked ETFs or whatever it is. To just wholesale dismiss something, I think is doing not just a disservice to your clients, but a disservice to you. Like you're closing off your mind to other things that exist. Are there bad people, bad advisors selling annuities? Sure, there are. There's also bad fee-only advisors. Like there is no exclusivity on where the good guys and the bad guys hang out in our industry. Yeah. Greg, I'd be curious, you had mentioned before we hit record that having worked in the RA space and now being back in the BD space, it's almost like you've seen the future, right? And you've kind of come back, right? Because there's kind of like this aspirational thing, like the highest pinnacle of the top mountain is to be your own independent RA, but that's not without trade-offs, right? So nobody ever talks about like, here's the trade-off to going RA only. Shed a little bit of light on that for us.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not for everybody. And I think through Ross's experience, I definitely witnessed that from the beginning of how much you actually need to take on as an independent business owner, depending on your staff. I mean, there's HR that falls on you, those responsibilities. There's technology. So you've got to pick. You've got this huge universe now. I mean, Michael Kitces' map is giant. Think about what that looked like 4 or 5 years ago. And he actually has a tool, I'm guessing you've probably seen it, where you can go to his website and say, I'm this size RIA is what I'm thinking about doing, and they kind of recommend a tech stack. Not a shill for Mike either.
No. It's a great tool. I mean, how do you possibly even begin categorizing all these things?
Right. And so you have something you pay for, right? If you're with a firm like LPL or a broker dealer that has a set tech platform that comes out of your income and it's available to you, they provide you the platform, and then you have your custodian. And now I think when it's, okay, do I choose Schwab? Do I choose Fidelity? Do I choose some of the up and coming custodial platforms? Where do I want to land? And then how do I want my firm to look externally? What's my DBA? What's my value proposition? Do I have a niche? How do I relay that to clients? What does my website look like? There's so much that goes into that versus going to a large established organization where you have your licenses and you don't have to solve for all that yourself. And I think Ross saw that firsthand. And I have so much choice now. That's a blessing and a curse. Like, how do I narrow it down to do what I want to do that meets my value proposition? And then what tools, technology, and solution set is going to be there for me? And how do I learn? Because you don't have the community. And one other thing that I found, I was very active within the Financial Planning Association. You see these networks, right?
Sure.
You don't have the BD conferences that you attend or the subgroups or the study groups that come out of that when you go fully independent. It is very different. It's very fragmented. And so I think that also too is a surprise to people. So how do I go learn? Who do I talk to? Who's like me? And I found those organizations like the Financial Planning Association to be a wonderful community. And it's interesting that it's not competitive. No one is there concerned about competing with each other for clients. There's a lot of idea sharing. There's a lot of best practice sharing, which is phenomenal. But that doesn't become obvious to you once you decide to move and change your business. That's something you have to rediscover. And that's where I think a wholesaler, or whatever you want to call us, regional consultant, can be a great connective tissue to a practice for those that do, to say, hey, here's where I see really good advisors. Here's where I can come and introduce you to some people that look like your firm to help you get through this transition and continue to grow and scale your firm.
Yeah, ultimately, that's how I got introduced to Tom Gow, who was a major mentor of mine. Is I had asked my wholesaler at the time, Michael Appleby, who's been on the podcast years ago, and I said, boy, what are the most successful practices doing? He says, Jarvis, there's this guy that they're all talking to, this guy, Tom Gow, you should join his program, right? And I did on that recommendation. So if you're meeting with the wholesaler, regional consultant, whatever the terminology we use these days, ask them, right? Like, hey, what are you seeing the best advisors doing? What are you seeing the people doing at the level above mine? Greg, I want to go back to what you said about this kind of decision overload on the RA space. Last year, I was at an event and Dan Sullivan for Strategic Coach was there, and he made this comment to the group. He said, everyone can do addition and no one can do subtraction. Now, he was speaking specifically to hosting events. He says, hey, all of you can do the math on how much revenue was generated by hosting this event. None of you are doing the math on how much it costs to put this on. So to the RA thing, we say, oh, look at how much my payout will be. It'll be 100%. Well, not really, because you still have to pay for all these things. Like, it's still going to happen. And to your point, you've got this decision overwhelm of, well, there's 400 different CRM options. Which one am I going to use? So what is there a theme, and I don't want to pick on anybody, but is there a theme you see with advisors that are consistently struggling, right? So you've been in the industry for a lot of years. You've seen some advisors really take off, and you've seen probably some that are still sort of where they were 5 or 7 or 10 years ago when you first met them. Like, what holds advisors back like that in your experience?
I mean, it can be a multitude of things. There's a lot of people that started a practice that they've kind of capped out and they're very much control oriented, right? They have a hard time delegating.
Interesting.
And I feel like delegation, when you see some of the best firms, they've done a really good job of separating out and putting a team around their clients versus kind of the one person operation. You see really well-oiled organizations that may have a lead relationship manager. They might have a CFP on staff. They might have a CFA. I feel like in this business, and this is kind of what I felt like when I started, because I came into an organization, this advisor probably has a little over 100 million of assets under management now. Really nice practice. But in order to scale and continue to get bigger, you can't do that by yourself. You can't do that with one staff person. You need to be able to delegate. And now you see some of these larger, even multi-billion-dollar firms, as they've grown, they've had to make that decision. So how do I delegate? And how do I show my clients that we have a multidisciplinary approach? And it's not just going to be me. Right? I may be communicating the decision. I will certainly have a hand in the decision. However, I'm not the one building the portfolio. I'm not building the plan. I'm not picking the solutions that are inside your actual investment portfolio. I may outsource and I may bring in a specialist for long-term care, life insurance, estate planning. So I feel like that's the biggest gap that people have to identify in what they're doing, is to be able to add, and it costs money, right? It's one of those things where you may not see the return for a couple of years. You have to make the investment. And I feel like a lot of those firms get to a point where they kind of cap out and they don't invest, or they have a hard time. And again, talent in our industry right now is so hard to find.
Oh yeah.
So I know it's easier said than done, but turnover is a big challenge as well, trying to find the right people, keeping them engaged, so that they are invested in your client's success so you can continue to grow.
I love really simple mantras, like things are really easy to remember. So I just was writing down that you said, hey, if you're at capacity, it's either a failure to delegate or a failure to invest, right? Which feels like a good reminder. Anytime I feel like, no, I'm really at my capacity. All right, what else can I delegate and where else can I invest? But both of those, like you said, those take a time to ROI. Like sometimes we think, oh, I'll delegate this and magically it will be off my plate. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. I mean, you got to train the person. You got to make sure they have systems in place. Yeah, but I really like that. So failure to invest, failure to delegate. Anything else that comes to mind, either along those lines or just in general, as you see practices that consistently struggle?
I think it's really hard for you to invest in yourself as well from an education perspective. Getting an advanced designation, whether it be a CFP or a CIMA or a CFA, whatever it is that is really interesting to you, and just taking the time to do that. And you also see that self-manifest itself in technology. So you bought that license to Money Guide Pro, or you bought that license to eMoney. How well do you understand it? How much do you actually take advantage of it? And I feel like so many advisors, and this goes back to the kind of the observation that I have the opportunity to see, is only have a surface level understanding of what it can do. But you're running so hard, you're seeing so many people, and you're successful. But how do you actually give yourself the permission slip to sit down and invest the time and energy and effort to use platforms like that for what you want to use them for and get the most out of them? And that's not easy. I mean, especially if you've got a family. I mean, I got 2 young kids. So even for me, thinking about something else down the road as far as the designation goes, trying to invest the time and energy is a tough trade-off.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I probably, to some extent, not to overly generalize, but our personality type of advisors isn't necessarily the type of, what I'd like to do is sit down and study the nuances of Money Guide Pro. But it does speak to investing yourself. I know a lot of programs, software programs we've used, we've hired consultants, which seems silly. Like, why would I hire a consultant to teach me how to use Money Guide Pro? They already have a training guide or Orion or whatever you're using. But again, I don't have the personality type to sit down and read the owner's manual. But if I invest in someone who can teach me how to do that, that's make a big difference.
Well, and use your partners. This goes back to the original discussion that we started on, is one of the reasons why you should take a meeting with somebody like me is when we were at my prior firm, we built an entire team of CFPs that focused on understanding innately Money Guide Pro, eMoney, Right Capital. And so we basically had a centralized resource that you could call in and ask for ideas, advice. It didn't have to be specific to the products we had. And we were able to be basically a collective group to share the wisdom of what we learned along the way. And so your partners, your wholesalers, do have great resources and access. Companies are investing. They're seeing the transition to planning. So they are creating dedicated positions and they're creating people that have good expertise. And maybe it's a CFP type person that doesn't want to be in personal production. There's a career path now at some of these carriers and some of these companies where they can use what they've learned with advisors and clients, but they don't have to be the one that's responsible for the firm, right? They don't have to be responsible for having the client relationship and taking the risk. They can do it in an institution. So that's a great way for you to delegate, or I guess outsource some of that knowledge and learn it as you go, versus it is very overwhelming trying to figure out an entire platform from start to finish if you don't have the capacity to do it.
That's a great observation, Greg, right? Kind of this mindset of, hey, somebody else has already figured this thing out, right? Whatever it is I'm trying to do, unless unless Elon Musk is listening, he's trying to figure out how to get to Mars, like, you're the first one, buddy. You got to figure it out on your own, right? The rest of us, though, somebody has figured this out already. So, Greg, like you said, whether it's talking to yourself and seeing what resources you have, or who do you know, or what do you see other people doing? I know I have the luxury, I have a pretty deep network inside the industry, having done the podcast for several years. But even just yesterday, we were looking for some new legal counsel in a specific area. And so I'm texting through my buddies, hey, who do you know who takes care of this? And I texted 10 different guys and got a couple answers. But if you don't have that network built into the industry, you've got these wholesalers that want to come by your office and they have access to that. And then you can decide from there, like, oh, I like that guy or don't. But don't feel like you've got to sit there by yourself and figure this stuff out and just beat your brains against the wall.
Right. And the good ones you'll know, right? You'll know what the value is. And if they're actually able to deliver on, we can help you build better outcomes using the software you purchase, Money Guide, eMoney, whatever it is. You'll know if they're true to their word or if they have no idea what they're talking about when you hop on that call, either with them or somebody on their team, and they start to show you some ideas. And then you'll be able to tell, okay, I'll get a lot of value out of this and I'll definitely learn something.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I remember I've been in the industry now 20 years. And in the early days of my career, when wholesalers would come by, it was like, let me tell you what the current yield is on the American funds, total growth fund of America, whatever there was back then. And now, like you said, it's so much more. Again, that fee compression hit everybody, advisors, wholesalers, product companies, everybody. What value are we bringing to the table that's going to help people out? Greg, can you think of a time where you were able to really make a difference to an advisor, either a specific case or in their practice? And you mentioned Ross as a great example of that, right? The guidance you're able to give him. But I'm just trying to think of some specific examples where we go from like, hey, we have these resources to here was a spot I was really able to help.
Oh, sure. I obviously alluded to the fact that the adoption in the fee-based annuity world has been slow but growing. But there were a number of people where we went through the full experience within the plan and we were able to implement and improve client outcomes. And that was a combination of income cases or risk management where we actually identified gaps. And I remember specific discussions with clients, and that was the most rewarding piece. There was one practice in particular, they were about a $75 million firm, state-registered RIA, 2 individuals, and they had been growing rapidly. And they had kind of broken away and built their own practice. And this was right as we were going through the volatility in 2020 and then ultimately, through 22, which as we know how it ended up, it wasn't great no matter where you invested. And I remember seeing them at the early part of this year and just the thank you of,
I bet
this worked exactly as stated. We are so glad we made this decision. Our clients are so happy. In fact, they asked us at the time if they could put all their money into these. And of course, that wasn't appropriate. But I can count on the number of, times on one hand where I've actually had someone else actually call me and thank me for educating them on something that worked as stated. It was such a rewarding experience to see how they protected their clients, but they also protected their assets under management. They protected their revenue. And that was critical to a firm that was trying to get over that $100 million hump, that was continuing to grow and make good impressions with clients. That's one example that stands out to me specifically over the last few years.
Well, that's a great example. One that comes to mind for me, and then I know we need to wrap up here, is that we've had some old, very, very old legacy annuities that were on the books that were from pre-financial crisis, like back in the glory days of living benefits and so forth. And the complexity of these things just gets really off the charts, whether the old ones or the new ones. And so we were able to send those to one of our wholesalers and say, hey, would you guys have your team do analysis and figure out what the heck these things are and what our options are to get in and out of them and what might something else exist, right? So what would have taken myself and my team countless hours to maybe decipher, we were able to hand that off. And then the next week, we were able to get answers on all of those. And we could then decide based on that information where to go from there. So,
you've got tremendous resources and access to all those individuals, and they can do it. They're the experts, right? They've been dealing with these for decades in some cases, and they can give you that information really quickly, like you said, versus trying to understand it yourself, study it, and then hope that you have accurate information.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, a couple of action items for our listeners, Greg, based on the notes I took from our call. And these are ones I wrote down. I'm implementing in my own practice, right? Which is, I love this idea. Anytime you feel your capacity, look for somewhere to delegate and look for somewhere to invest. Remember that somebody's already figured this out and let them do the heavy lifting, right? You do the thing that only you can do, which is meet with clients and run your practice. Let somebody else do all the other things. So, Greg, thank you again for coming on the show. Really appreciate your insights and kind of sharing your perspective on the advisor industry. And for all of our listeners, until next time, happy planning.